The flow of time is always cruel. Everything that has or will ever exist will eventually run its course. It's a fundamental truth about our universe, but we do our best to preserve art and history so future generations can appreciate and learn from them. That doesn't mean we're perfect at it. We've lost more than we know to time, and that includes some games. I know that 100 years from now, I would like people to be able to play the greatest, most important, and influential games. Even just in my lifetime, I want to be able to share my favorite games, and for people to have the opportunity to play them. The reason I was thinking about this was because of the recent trailer for the Demon's Souls remake being developed by Blue Point Games. Before I get into this, I want to say that this video isn't about Demon's Souls or any other game I mentioned specifically, but you'll see what I mean as I go along. If you don't know what Demon's Souls is, it's the first big success of the company From Software that eventually led to the release of Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro. It's undeniably one of the most important games to the 7th generation of consoles. Beyond that, it's a unique experience even within the Soul series. Just by raw numbers, new fans are unlikely to have played it. Demon's Souls eventually ended up selling around 1 million copies. While you combine that with just the Dark Souls series, they've sold over 27 million. Personally, Dark Souls and Demon's Souls are two of my favorite games ever, but Demon's Souls is unfortunately being remembered as a Dark Souls prototype when that really isn't the case. It's hard to recommend to people to go out and find out why that isn't true for themselves for two reasons. One, you have to own a PS3, a discontinued console. Two, then you have to try and find the used copy somewhere. So it takes a little bit of legwork. So now that this remake has finally surfaced, I'm cautiously awaiting it because it really doesn't look like the original game. That's a really vague statement for me to make, so I'm going to try to give some specific examples. The first thing that I was taken aback by was the redesign of Flame Lurker. I'm going to be completely honest with you here. I don't think Flame Lurker's original design was genius or super unique or anything like that, but it fit in well with the rest of the game. When you're fighting Flame Lurker, it acts and looks like a monster, but taking a closer look at its face reveals more to the story. You can see it resembles something of a human face that's been melted away, particularly in his one eye that's lost some flesh on it, and the area where the mouth used to be just holds its teeth now. It appears that the demon was once a human and has lost all sense of themselves. And that's the kind of subtle storytelling that From Software excels at. With this redesign, Flame Lurker ends up looking kind of generic and loses any semblance of those subtle hints to his story. Again, I don't feel like I'm overly attached to Flame Lurker or anything. On the larger scale of Demon's Souls, he's mostly remembered for his difficulty and not his uniqueness. What I'm trying to say is that something is being lost in the translation with this game. You can see it in the over-designed Vanguard screenshots, you can see it in the color and brightness being off in tone, and you can see it in the over-designed cathedral architecture that goes against the militaristic fortress look of Boletaria. I've seen the argument that this was what the game was supposed to look like, if not for the hardware limitations, and I think that's an enormous jump in logic to make, especially if you consider that the concept art for Boletaria, which you see in the game, shares those designs. I want to stress that I think a lot of these designs are actually very good, but they just don't look like Demon's Souls. Any game could dream to look as good as what we've been presented so far, but I want people to experience the same game that I did, and Demon's Souls' greatest strength was its immersive experience and atmosphere, and when you make changes like that, it could harm the overall experience. The new look is unfaithful. 15 years from now, is the original Demon's Souls going to be accessible for newer audiences? It's getting harder and harder for people to play it every day. So if this remake turns out to be a poor representation of that game, people won't have the same experience. I don't want to speculate too hard on a game that isn't even out yet, so let's move on to the main point. Like I said earlier, really this video actually isn't about Demon's Souls specifically, but all of these thoughts came back to me when I saw that trailer, and I thought it would be a good time to discuss them. You can think of this video as more presenting the concept that recreating things might seem right on the surface will actually turn out to have some underlying issues. and in a general sense, how game remakes in their current state are an issue to preservation. When it comes to preserving games, right now we're in a tricky spot, and current trends don't seem to be making things much better. Games are a weird merger of science and art. Specifically speaking, their software, and recreating them isn't as easy as you might think. Software is always created to run on specific platforms, like a console or operating system. As time moves forward, hardware becomes discontinued, and software stops getting published, making it increasingly harder and harder for older games to be experienced. You can't simply move an existing game and move it over to a new platform. It takes a lot of work, and even with the most talented team, it's very easy to get some details wrong. The only alternative to having the original platform is to build an emulator for that platform, port the game so it runs natively on new hardware, or remake it, which is the best opportunity for companies to make money. Each of these solutions come with its own set of problems. For one, building an emulator isn't easy even if you have the original source code. When I say emulators, I don't mean just fan-made ones like Dolphin or PCSX. I'm also talking about ones like the virtual consoles for the Wii and Wii U as well. Just from those two examples, the Wii Virtual Console was said to be far better than the Wii U's. And that's my point, that even Nintendo rebuilding their own platform doesn't always come out perfectly. It's legitimately a difficult thing to do, and the more accurate you want to be to the original hardware, the more exponentially stronger processing power you'll need. It's better than nothing, but it's definitely not ideal. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that emulation can sometimes run games better than they ran even on the original hardware, and you might see an example of that in this very video. I'm not against emulation in general, it's just not necessarily a catch-all solution either. Steam seems to be a great platform for getting games to be preserved for the future, but ports aren't easy either. I know a lot of people like to say that it would be free money for a developer to just put it on PC, but after countless numbers of botched PC ports, we know that it's not as easy as you think, especially since many games had specific code for the hardware it was built for. For example, some developers would write code to grab specific information from a physical location on a disk because it would load that information faster. And any other physical media, even when transitioning it from a DVD to a Blu-ray, would make that code not work, let alone having it transition to a downloadable title. Now the team needs to take that existing code and completely rewrite it, which then requires testing, and you get the idea. It's not easy. Personally, I think ports and remasters are the best way to go, but they do require work and money, and it's a risk of whether or not people even buy it on the new platform. Remakes run a very fine line of developers wanting to improve the original game and being faithful, and sometimes the right balance isn't found. Sometimes they miss the mark entirely and put the classic title into more trouble than it was originally in. Remakes allow developers to change the most when compared to a port or remaster, and going by sales usually makes the publishers the most money, so I'm not surprised this option has been taken many times. That being said, right now remakes are being treated as ways of replacing the original instead of preserving it. Without examples, maybe this sounds too conceptual, so I'm going to cover a range of remakes and specific problems they have. Maybe that'll get my point across more clearly. I won't be going too in depth about all the little changes, but just to get the general idea. The first series I want to cover is The Legend of Zelda. The most obvious problematic games are the two different Wind Wakers that history has to deal with now. The original Wind Waker is by no means perfect, but it is a very good Zelda, and the most impressive aspect is the full realization of its art style. As someone with zero formal art training or ability, I can make the subjective opinion that it might be the most aesthetically pleasing game ever created. Even if you don't agree with that, you might be able to agree with that the biggest appeal of this title over other Zelda games is its aesthetic, feel-good vibes, and the abundant amount of charm, with the biggest issues being the amount of monotony and padding towards the end of the game. The Wind Waker HD and the Wii U set out to solve those issues and also be used as a testing ground to work with the Wii U for the next Zelda title. According to Nintendo, the Wind Waker's cel-shaded style worked best with the new lighting system, so they decided to remake that game just to get accustomed to it. With this remake, a lot of the annoying little things that plagued the original game have been updated, and also being able to aim with the gyro controls or start the game from hero mode were great additions. If those were the only changes, it would have been a success. A major flaw: they chose to overhaul the graphics as well. The new art style attempts to be faithful to the original, but there's two major issues. Wind Waker HD is not cel-shaded in the same way that the original is, and there's also an excessive amount of blue in almost every area in the game. Cel shading is a type of 3D graphics that attempts to emulate the feelings of cartoons and comic books. and gives the render a feeling of being painted on paper. It does this by using one solid color of things instead of a gradient of colors that smoothly link into each other. The HD version clearly doesn't do this. Everything in the game has a much more apparent gradient to it, especially when the light sources shine brightly on them. The colors in general feel a little bit too bright, but that might just be them reacting to the new lighting system. The original definitely felt like it was crafted on paper, and I can't really say that's true for the HD version. The bloom, while not as bad as it was originally presented to us, can still be an absolute eyesore in some areas. Any game could dream to look half as good as the Wind Waker HD, but that doesn't mean it's faithful or matches the original. I wouldn't discourage people from playing the HD version either. It's a great game. Now there's an issue. The Wii U, a system that's already been discontinued by Nintendo, so eventually the Wind Waker is going to have to be ported or remade again. When Nintendo chooses to do that, which one do you think is going to be the one they move forward? If I had to bet, it'd be the HD version, simply for the fact that it's built on a newer architecture and it would be simpler to transfer it over. Will the original art style be forever trapped in the GameCube? Maybe you think it's petty of me to think this way, and even if you don't agree with me, at least you can see my logic. There are now two Wind Wakers, the original with the more comfy and cel-shaded art style, and one with the superior gameplay. Hopefully in the future, we can get an updated version that's the best of both worlds. The reason I brought this one up first is because it's very easy to understand why it's problematic just by looking at them. You might not realize this, but Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask face the worst issue with their 3DS remakes. As of right now, the only way to play these games outside of owning the original hardware are on a discontinued Wii U, on the Virtual Console, or their 3DS remakes, a system whose clock is ticking. The Ocarina Remake is largely considered to be an improvement on the original game, especially with regards to the Water Temple. Allowing you to assign the iron boots on the face buttons eliminates the absolute tedium that came from equipping and unequipping them. It basically saves the dungeon with that alone, as the actual design is quite good. The only contentious things are smaller details like the lighting on certain cutscenes and certain environmental details. The bigger issue is that because this is a 3DS game, they're not likely to bring it over to a new console. They're far more likely to remake the game again on whatever the current hardware is. So they'll have to redo the graphics again, especially since they were made for the 3DS's small 240p screen. Maybe they'll also adjust the gameplay a little more again, a touch here, a touch there, and eventually what you get could end up being very different from the source material. What's more troubling is Majora's Mask's potential terrible fate. Changes made in the 3DS version are quite substantial, and it didn't sit well with some of the die-hard fans of the original game. I'll fast forward through a lot of them here if you want to take a look. Where you could see Ocarina of Time 3D as an upgrade to the original, you can't really say the same for Majora's Mask 3D. So take that same scenario from earlier, and the situation of another remake being vastly different from the original is quite more likely. I'm sure a lot of people like the new changes, don't get me wrong, but if more of these could have been optional, then it would have been for the better. I'm sure Nintendo will continue to nickel and dime us for the ROMs of these games for years to come, but how many games will be so lucky? You still might see this as a bit hyperbolic, so I want to move on to a series where this already happened. The Resident Evil remakes are often considered as some of the best remakes of all time, which is a major accomplishment since the original two games were already innovative and critically acclaimed. You would be hard pressed to find anyone who prefers the original Resident Evil on PS1 to the remake on GameCube and subsequently all the remasters of that remake like on PS4 and PC. This is because Shinji Mikami, who directed both the original and the remake, took care to be very faithful to the original. There's so much that's the same, and what's been added is often considered to be better, that no one really lamented the loss of their Jill sandwiches. I still think the original should be available for you to play, just for history's sake, but Capcom is treating the remake as an overwrite to the original. Regardless of how you feel about that situation, the Resident Evil 2 remake is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier. Many people have been asking for this remake since 2002, and we finally got it in 2019, and it was great, but it's more of a reimagining than a straight remake. That's how much it differs from the original game. I might be in the minority here, but I think the original game still stands up very well and is a great game. The Resident Evil 2 remake is a new evolution for the series, combining the new controls of the later games without portraying the horror aspects of it. Perhaps the Resident Evil 2 remake's greatest trick is making people feel like they were playing the original game despite how different it actually is. Entire sections of the map have been changed, encounters have been changed, the camera has been changed, rooms have been changed, the story has been changed. Essentially, there are now two games by the name Resident Evil 2, but we will have to rely on Capcom for both of those games to be available. With the huge success of Resident Evil 2 2. Capcom has already confirmed that a Resident Evil 4 remake is being worked on. Without Shinji Mikami directing, a lot of people are worried, but I think we should tackle that issue when we get there. But at what point is this going to stop? An over-reliance of familiar brands in the video game market in general is to blame, but perhaps that's a topic for a different time. Hopefully by now you understand what I'm getting. And these examples are of remakes that are generally well received. I even prefer some of the remakes that I mentioned. They are, however, problematic in terms of preserving history if the proper steps aren't taken by the copyright holders. There are plenty of bad remakes that I could have cited, but I think would have been a disservice to the hard work of the people who actually do try to make great remakes. The goal of this video wasn't to rip apart video game remakes for the sake of it. It was to raise awareness to the ongoing problems that video games have with them. I don't want this video to be too negative, so I want to give credit where credit is due. Metroid Zero Mission is a reimagining of the original Metroid, and I think it deserves to be praised for something surprisingly uncommon. Sure, the game itself is brilliant, and some even think it's the best Metroid title, and I can certainly see where they're coming from, even if I don't agree. It is, however, not faithful at all to the original. The entire game philosophy from the original, which was a very open game and forced you to discover things for yourself, is now replaced with a very railroaded journey where you're directly shown where to go all the time. And if that was all the game had to offer, I would be a little trouble with it, even though I do love it. What I really wanted to talk about was the original Metroid is completely playable within the game. This is the best of both worlds. You remake the game for modern audiences while simultaneously preserving the original title with it. Of course, this is possible because the original game is much smaller in file size than modern games, but the idea of it is brilliant. The Halo Master Chief Collection, while not perfect renditions, has one really great feature that I wish many of the remakes had. During the campaign, with just the press of a button and no load times, you can switch between the anniversary graphics and the classic graphics. Of course, this is probably a lot harder than we give credit for, but it's commendable for 343 Studios to go through the effort of doing this. I'm sure there were many programmers that banged their head against the wall for a long time while they got this thing to work properly. Games like the Wind Waker HD's problem would be solved instantly. You keep the gameplay improvements and the original art style. Even if it only worked by setting it up in the menu before you enter the game proper, it would still be a great solution. On the greater topic of preservation, one of the greatest solutions actually came from Sega with their Mega Drive/Genesis Classics release on Steam. When you buy this collection or any of the individual games, you now have full ownership of the ROMs. The collection comes with a Sega built emulator, and truth be told, it's not the best emulator out there, but it doesn't matter because you can just use the ROMs in any emulator you want, and it would be completely legal for you to do that. It also allowed for Europeans to play the 60Hz versions instead of the 50Hz versions of certain games, which ran about 10% slower than the originals. If they ever choose to remake any of these titles, you'll always have access to these ROMs now. You just have to depend on Sega to keep this available for as long as possible, and hopefully release more titles this way. There is one game that I know will be preserved for as long as the internet exists. If you watch the other videos on my channel, you won't be surprised that I'm talking about Doom again, and probably not even for the last time. Back in 1997, John Carmack had to really push his weight around to get the Doom source code to be officially released to the public for free. He convinced the other heads at id Software that this would actually give the game an extended life, as it would allow modders to go all out, and that would eventually lead to more sales for id. On the official release, John Carmack even encourages players to add features not present in Doom, like jumping or vertical aiming, and he couldn't have been more right. Even to this day, custom Doom mods are being developed and released. You can go on websites such as Doom World and find new custom WADs for you to play. The original Doom will be playable for as long as people care enough to port it. It would be a much smaller list of game platforms that don't have some version of Doom since its release in 1993. Even non-gaming devices can run Doom, and while really that's just a novelty, it goes to show that Doom will live on for a very long time, and what a game to live on. Wolfenstein 3D and Quake share this accolade with Doom, as their source codes are also released for free. You can't really expect even 1% of companies to do this. We should count our lucky stars that Carmack came from an open source development world. The future can be saved, and it's our job to demand better of companies and copyright holders to make sure of it. The groundwork by certain game companies has already been set. Remember, the biggest thing you can do is vote with your wallets. So when companies actually do something great for this, make sure to support it, and when they don't give them money for it. It's up to us, and I know we can do it. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing. With that, I'll see you next mission.